The wind was a cruel artist, sculpting the endless Montana prairie into a desolate masterpiece of white. It howled a mournful song around the corners of a solitary cabin, a tiny, defiant speck against the vast, unforgiving snow. For weeks, the world had been buried in winter's embrace, the sky a perpetual, heavy gray that promised more of the same. Inside the small structure, the air was frigid, the cold seeping through the chinks in the timber walls like a persistent thief. Mai Lin shivered, pulling a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her breath plumed in front of her face, a fleeting ghost in the gloom. The last of her firewood had turned to ash that morning, and the final handful of flour was a dusty memory. She was alone, a stranger in a land that was as cold and unwelcoming as the stares she often received in the distant town. Her parents had passed on the journey west, their dreams of a new life buried with them under foreign soil. Now, their only daughter was left to face the biting winter with nothing but a fierce, quiet determination and the skills they had taught her. She wore a light pink prairie dress, a garment of a life she had barely begun to live. The delicate color was a stark, almost defiant contrast to the monochrome world outside and the bleakness threatening to settle in her heart. In the polished surface of a cold tin plate, she saw her reflection, a young woman with almond-shaped eyes that held an old sorrow, framed by straight, black hair. She was slim and carried a quiet grace, but in the eyes of many settlers, she was only one thing, different. An outsider. A sudden, powerful knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one ever came this far out, especially not in a storm that was beginning to gather its strength anew. Hesitantly, she unlatched the door, pulling it open just enough to peer out. The man standing on her doorstep was a giant, his frame filling the entire doorway and blocking out what little light the afternoon offered. Snow clung to the wide brim of his hat and the thick collar of his greatcoat. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, his face carved from years of hard labor and exposure to the elements, yet his eyes, a startling clear gray, held a sharp, assessing intelligence. This was Alastair Blackwood, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and respect across the territory. He had built the formidable Blackwood Ranch from nothing, a testament to his unyielding will. "Miss," he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in the cold air. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Alastair Blackwood. I was told a woman lived out here alone, one who knows her way around a kitchen." Mai Lin's grip tightened on the door. She had heard the stories, of course. He was a man of immense power and few words, known for his stern demeanor and the empire of cattle he commanded. What could he possibly want with her? "My cook has taken ill," he continued, his gaze direct and unwavering. "A winter fever. The men on my ranch, they're good men, but their cooking is an affront to God and man. The snow is getting worse, and I need someone to see the household through the winter. I will pay well." A flicker of hope, so fragile she was almost afraid to acknowledge it, sparked within her. This could be a lifeline, a rescue from the slow, freezing starvation that awaited her. She could cook. It was more than a skill, it was an art, a language she had learned from her mother, a way to pour love and memory into something that could warm a person from the inside out. The thought of a warm kitchen, of plentiful ingredients, of purpose, was a dizzying temptation. But then, the familiar chill of reality washed over her. She saw the way some of the townsfolk looked at her, their whispers like wasps in the air. She was a curiosity at best, an unwelcome presence at worst. Why would this powerful man be any different? The shame of her otherness, an invisible brand she could never escape, rose in her throat. She couldn't meet his gaze, her eyes falling to the worn floorboards. "No one loves a Chinese girl, sir," she whispered, the words tasting of bitter experience. "But I can cook." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind. Mai Lin braced herself for the inevitable rejection, the polite but firm dismissal. She expected him to tip his hat, mutter an apology for bothering her, and disappear back into the storm, leaving her to her fate. Instead, Alastair Blackwood did something that truly shocked her. He took a step closer, his formidable presence filling her small, cold cabin. He reached up, not to tip his hat in departure, but to remove it entirely, revealing a head of thick, dark hair lightly dusted with grey at the temples. His expression was not one of pity or dismissal, but of a surprising, stern intensity. "Miss," he said, his voice dropping lower, cutting through the wind's howl with an authority that was absolute. "I don't give a damn where a person comes from. I care what they're made of. I'm not looking for a wife to be loved. I'm looking for a cook who can keep my men from poisoning themselves before the spring thaw. Can you cook, or can't you?" His words were not gentle, but they were a balm to her wounded spirit. He hadn't flinched from her statement, he had shattered it, dismissed it as irrelevant. He saw her not as a Chinese girl, but as a person with a skill he needed. For the first time in a long time, someone was looking past her face to see what she could do. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot against her cold skin. She lifted her chin, meeting his piercing grey gaze directly for the first time. "I can cook, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice small but clear and steady. "I can cook better than anyone you've ever known." A hint of something, perhaps respect, perhaps amusement, softened the hard lines of his mouth. "Good," he said simply. "Pack your things. The storm is worsening. You'll ride with me." There was little to pack, a small wooden chest containing her parents' cherished belongings, a change of clothes, and the tin plate that had served as her mirror. Within minutes, she was ready. Alistair led her out into the swirling snow, lifting her effortlessly onto the front of his powerful horse as if she weighed nothing at all. He wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her, his movements efficient and impersonal, yet the warmth that seeped into her frozen limbs felt like the most profound act of kindness she had ever known. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a battle against the elements. The wind drove skewers of ice into any exposed skin, and the snow fell so thickly that the world was reduced to a churning vortex of white. But huddled against Alistair's solid form, shielded by his broad back, Mai Lin felt a sense of security she hadn't experienced since her father was alive. He was a bulwark against the storm, silent and unmoving, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos. As they crested a final hill, the ranch appeared below them, a collection of sturdy buildings glowing with warm, welcoming light against the deepening twilight. It was larger than she could have imagined, a self-contained fortress against the wildness of the land and the fury of the winter. Dozens of men moved about, their figures bundled against the cold, their breath misting in the lantern light as they secured livestock and battened down hatches for the night. When Alistair rode into the main yard with Mai Lin seated before him, a hush fell over the assembled hands. Work ceased as every eye turned to the strange sight. She could feel their stares, 100 questions and judgments prickling her skin. She pulled the blanket tighter, her brief flicker of hope dimming under the weight of their scrutiny. A burly, bearded man with a sour expression stepped forward. "Boss? What in tarnation?" "This is Mai Lin," Alistair announced, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "She's our new cook. See that she's shown to the kitchens and given whatever she needs. The first man who shows her anything less than respect will answer directly to me." His tone was final, a clear and undeniable warning that left no room for argument. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The sour-faced man, who she would later learn was named Grimes, spat a wad of tobacco into the snow, his eyes lingering on Mai Lin with open hostility. But no one dared to contradict their boss. A younger ranch hand, with kind eyes and a friendly face, stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Welcome, Name's Finn. Let me show you the way. It's warm in there." Mai Lin slid down from the horse, her legs stiff and numb. She gave a brief, grateful nod to Finn and a hesitant, questioning look towards Alistair. He merely gave a curt nod in return before turning to issue orders about the coming storm. His protection was a shield, but she knew it was a borrowed one. She would have to earn her place here on her own terms. Following Finn, she stepped into the ranch house kitchen, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a world away from her tiny, freezing cabin. A massive cast-iron stove radiated a glorious, life-giving heat. The room was spacious and well-stocked, with sacks of flour and sugar, strings of dried herbs, and shelves laden with jars of preserves. It was a temple dedicated to the art of cooking, and for the first time since she arrived in this cold country, My Lin felt a glimmer of something that felt dangerously like hope. Here, amidst the pots and pans, she was not an outsider. She was an artist in her studio. Here, she could make them see. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the rumbling bellies of hard-working men and the relentless rhythm of the winter. From before dawn until long after dusk, My Lin commanded the kitchen. Her initial timidity vanished the moment she tied on an apron. She moved with a quiet, confident grace, her hands, which had once trembled with cold and fear, now sure and steady as she kneaded dough, chopped vegetables, and stirred simmering pots. Her cooking was a revelation. It was not the bland, heavy fare the men were used to. She prepared thick, hearty beef stews, but infused them with star anise and ginger she found in a forgotten corner of the pantry, creating a depth of flavor that was both exotic and deeply comforting. Her bread was legendary, each loaf emerging from the oven with a perfectly golden crust and a soft, cloud-like interior. She made pies with flaky, buttery crusts and apple fillings spiced with cinnamon and a hint of orange zest. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere on the ranch began to change. The men's initial suspicion and hostility began to melt away, replaced by a grudging respect and then an open appreciation. The kitchen, once just a room for preparing meals, became the heart of the ranch house. Men would find excuses to linger by the stove, drawn by the incredible smells and the quiet warmth of My Lin's presence. Finn, the young hand who had first welcomed her, became her staunchest ally. He would bring her freshly chopped wood without being asked and tell her stories of the ranch, his open, friendly chatter a welcome antidote to the silence of others. Even some of the older, more skeptical men began to thaw. They would enter the kitchen, hats in hand, and mumble their thanks, their eyes full of a new respect. They started calling the ranch house home, a word it had never truly earned before. However, Grimes remained a pocket of bitter resistance. He ate her food, but he never missed an opportunity to make a cutting remark, always just loud enough for her to hear. Fancy foreign spices, he'd sneer. Ain't fit for a white man's gut. His prejudice was a constant, low-level poison, a reminder that acceptance was not universal. Alastair Blackwood remained a distant, enigmatic figure. He took his meals with his men in the main hall, and his praise was always polite but brief. The meal was excellent, Miss Lin, he would say with a formal nod, his grey eyes unreadable. Yet, My Lin often felt his gaze on her. She would look up from kneading dough to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with a quiet, intense concentration. He never said more than a few words, but his presence lingered long after he was gone. One evening, as she was cleaning up, she found a small bundle of frost-covered wildflowers on the kitchen stoop, their delicate purple heads a shocking splash of color against the snow. There was no note, and when she asked Finn about them the next day, he just shrugged, though his eyes twinkled with a knowing light. The true test came when the promised storm finally broke its leash and descended upon the ranch with apocalyptic fury. For 3 days and nights, the wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled in monstrous drifts that buried fences and reached the eaves of the barns. The world outside ceased to exist, and the ranch became an isolated island in a roiling sea of white. On the second night of the blizzard, a cry of alarm went up from the bunkhouse. One of the younger hands, a boy named Billy, had been stricken with a raging fever. His breathing was ragged, his skin burning to the touch. The rancher's supply of medicine was low, and the foreman despaired. They were trapped, with no way to reach a doctor. Without a moment's hesitation, My Lin went to work. She remembered the remedies her grandmother had used, the ancient knowledge passed down through generations. She sent Finn to fetch snow for pure, clean water and began raiding the pantry for ingredients the men had overlooked. She simmered a potent, fragrant broth from ginger root, honey, and a blend of herbs she recognized. Grimes watched her with a contemptuous scowl. "What's that witch's brew?" he scoffed. "You'll poison the boy." "It will break his fever," My Lin replied calmly, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She didn't look at him, her hands deftly straining the hot liquid. Alastair, who had been coordinating efforts to keep the livestock from freezing, entered the kitchen just in time to hear the exchange. His face was grim, etched with exhaustion. He looked from Grimes's sneering face to My Lin's determined one. "Let her work," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for dissent. He turned to My Lin. "Do what you can." She met his gaze, and in his tired eyes, she saw not skepticism, but a flicker of trust. It was all the encouragement she needed. She spent the night by Billy's bedside, coaxing the warm, healing broth past his lips, sponging his brow with cool water. Alistair stayed with her, sitting silently in a corner of the room, his presence a steady, unspoken support. They didn't talk much, but in the shared vigil of that long, stormy night, a quiet understanding began to form between them. He watched the gentle, unwavering care she showed the sick boy, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her small frame. By morning, the miracle had happened. Billy's fever had broken. He was weak and exhausted, but his breathing was even, his eyes clear. When the foreman came to check on him, he stared in disbelief before turning to My Lin with tears in his eyes, stammering his profound gratitude. The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. The men looked at her with newfound awe. She was not just a cook, she was a healer. Even Grimes was silenced, unable to deny the evidence before him. The blizzard raged for another day before finally exhausting itself. When the world emerged, it was a place transformed, silent and pristine under a blanket of deep snow. The shared crisis had forged a new bond among the inhabitants of the Blackwood Ranch. The men worked together to dig themselves out, their camaraderie stronger than ever. And something had irrevocably shifted between My Lin and Alistair. The formal distance between them had been bridged by the shared intimacy of that long night. He began to seek out her company, finding reasons to be in the kitchen. He would help her carry heavy sacks of flour or simply sit at the large wooden table, sipping tea and watching her work. He asked her about her home, the land she had left behind. In halting English, she told him stories of the festivals, the food, the vibrant colors of a world so different from this vast, white landscape. In turn, he spoke of the land, of his dream to build something that would last, of the profound loneliness that came with being the master of it all. He noticed the small things, the way she would hum a soft, unfamiliar melody as she worked, the delicate way she arranged even the simplest meal on a plate, the quiet dignity that she carried like a shield. He saw not a fragile foreign flower, but a woman of incredible resilience and profound kindness. One evening, as the sun set, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold, Alistair asked her to walk with him. They stood by the corral, the air crisp and cold, their breath mingling in the fading light. He turned to her, his usual stern expression softened by an emotion she couldn't quite name. "My Lin," he began, his voice rough with feeling. "Before you came here, this was just a place of work. A collection of buildings filled with rough men. You've changed that. You brought warmth. You brought life back into it." He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "They see you as a healer, a cook. But I see more. I see a woman with more courage and heart than anyone I have ever met." My Lin's own heart hammered against her ribs. She was afraid to hope, afraid to believe what she was seeing in his eyes. "That first day," he continued, his voice a low whisper, "you told me no one loves a Chinese girl. I've come to realize that any man who wouldn't love you is a fool not worthy of the name." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently taking hers. It was the first time he had touched her outside of necessity, and a jolt went through her, warm and powerful. "I am not a man for fancy words, My Lin. I have built an empire of land and cattle, but my home has been empty. I don't want it to be empty anymore." He paused, his grey eyes full of a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. "I'm asking you to share it with me. I'm asking you to be my wife." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the image of the strong, proud man standing before her. They were not tears of sorrow or shame, but of a joy so overwhelming it felt like a tidal wave. All her life, she had felt invisible, defined by the shape of her eyes and the color of her skin. But this man, this powerful, quiet rancher, saw her. He saw all of her. "The men, what will people say?" she whispered, the old fears dying hard. Alistair's grip on her hand tightened. A genuine, breathtaking smile transformed his face. "Let them say what they will," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that swept away her final doubts. "This is our life, not theirs. And my life began the day you rode with me through the storm." He drew her closer, and in the vast, silent expanse of the snow-covered prairie, under a sky ablaze with the last light of day, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that spoke of lonely winters and the promise of a shared spring, a kiss that sealed a bond forged in hardship and tempered in the quiet warmth of a kitchen hearth. Months later, the ranch hands would gather to watch their boss marry the Chinese cook. Some outsiders might have whispered and judged, but on the Blackwood Ranch, there was only celebration. For they knew that Alistair Blackwood's best decision had nothing to do with cattle or land, but with recognizing the enduring truth that a home is not built with timber and nails, but with courage, kindness, and love. And Mai Lin, who had once believed herself unlovable, stood beside her husband, the lady of the ranch, her heart as full and warm as the endless Montana sky.